Um, where so we began our conversation way back when with a discussion of what it means for statements, one or more statements, to entail another statement. In other words, we began our semester talking about the concept of validity. We moved on to list the technical features of an argument such that we can talk about whether or not the premises entail the conclusion, right? So we have a sense of the technical features of an argument. We got a name for the idea of an inferential flow from one or more statements to another. And then we began to talk about features of language specific to statements. We also talked a bit about, in connection with validity, we talked a bit about arguments that we can evaluate according to another standard, namely inductive strength and weakness, also inductive cogency and uncogency. But as we know, the focus of our course is on the set of systems of logic that yield arguments that are evaluated according to entailment or validity. In other words, we're studying deductive systems. Okay, so like I said, we talked a bit about statements. Then we moved into a discussion of not just individual sentences or statements that are so-called simple statements. That is, a statement that doesn't have a connective, or a statement that is the smallest linguistic entity that has a truth value, right? So we started off with the simple statement, and we began to build compound statements. And we built compound statements out of what are known as the Boolean connectives. So we spent a bunch of time talking about how the Boolean connectives work. In other words, what they mean, how you translate from an ordinary English sentence into the symbolic logic notation that involves the operators, the Boolean connective symbols, right? We also talked about, importantly, the use of truth tables to determine the truth or falsity of a statement that is governed by a Boolean connective. We talked about what it means for a Boolean connective to be true or false. So we talked about the truth definitions. And sorry, I went a little bit out of order. And then we also talked about how we can assess statements, right? So is a statement, a tautology, self-contradictory, contingently true, right? We also compared statements. Are two statements equivalent or not? That is tautologically equivalent or truth table equivalent. So in short, what we talked about is how the truth table gives us effectively a theory of and mechanism for determining truth, right? So we talked about truth functionality, or truth as a function of simple statements and the connectives, the Boolean connectives that govern them. From there, we were in a position to look at the truth functional inference rules, that is, valid arguments that serve as rules for demonstrating the truth of a valid argument, where that argument is constituted where that argument sentences include those constituted by governed rather by Boolean connectives, right? And we saw in this portion of the study that the rules that we learned come in pairs, right? Intro, elim, intro, elim. And the process of demonstrating the conclusion of a valid argument was a process of assembling and disassembling. And we learned about strategies, namely the subproof rules, that allow us to kind of set up a blueprint for how we're going to get to our conclusion, how we're going to establish our conclusion. We then added two more connectives, the propositional logic connectives, conditional and biconditional. We did the same thing for those with respect to the truth definitions, truth tables, equivalent statements, whether or not a conclusion follows truth functionally from premises and so forth. And finally, we learned the intro and the limb rules for those two operators, strategies as well. Now, everything we've done, so now here we are at, what is it, chapter 22, well, 21. We're going to scoop all that up. We're bringing it forward to the work that will be the capstone, if you will, of our semester. Okay, so what I'd like to do is just start out with a sort of an overview of sentences, and then we'll move into the technical features of what's known as quantifier logic. Okay, and as always, if anywhere along the way you have a question, problem, or confusion, let me know. I'm going to do my best to hew as much as possible to the order that the order of elements that the textbook follows, so that you can sort of key in what we're talking about to those chapters. Okay, so hello, Cameron. Cameron, we were just doing just a really big overview of the previous material. Okay, so let's quickly go over the statement types. Right, so we have simple and compound. And we're going to also talk about, of the simple and compound, we've been talking about what are known as singular, but we're about to talk about also quantified sentences. So basically, the logic that we've been doing gives us a lot of robust knowledge and skills. Now with quantifier logic, we are making, extending what we know, and will extend what we know how to do, and thereby making our logical skill set more robust. Okay. All right, so recall that a simple sentence, now that we know what connectives are, a simple sentence is a sentence that doesn't have a connective, isn't governed by a connective, doesn't involve a connective. So a simple sentence, no connective. Right? A compound sentence involves one or more simple sentences and at least one connective. And again, we know now that by a connective we mean not just the Boolean connectives, but also the propositional connectives, conditional and biconditional. Let me go ahead and also clarify a little bit more here. Okay, now we haven't really talked about the sentences, the statements, in terms of, if you will, singularity. But that's what we've been doing. So a singular statement is about a specified person, place, thing, etc. Right? And I'll give you an example. So singular sentence example. right? Walter barks, right? It's just about this named entity, Walter, right? The singular sentence, we already know, can be simple, as this example is. It can also be compound, right? So we could say, Walter barks, but Brett does not, right? So we can say again, simple, compound, right? So when we're talking effectively about named entities, we've got what's known as a singular sentence. And like I said, that's what we've been dealing with. In fact, even if we deal with what we'll see are quantified sentences, we can treat them as singular, right? Is it as accurate as we'd like? No, but it's not like we can't do that. So I'll try to give you what I hope is a clear example in just a moment. A quantified sentence is about non-specified groups or classes of thing, quantities of things or thing, right? So let me give you an example following along with the Walter and Brett examples that we just used. So quantified, that should be examples, quantified sentence, examples, something barks. We could also, if we want to be more exhaustive, if you will, about the what I'll call the domain of discourse, we could say some dogs bark, right? We can also talk about rephrase. We can also say that quantified sentences, start one more time. We can also bring our connectives to bear in quantified sentences. So, for example, we could say something barks, but something does not. And by the way, I'm going to just make a little, I'm going to put a little asterisk here, because one of the things that's tricky about, but really, in my view, valuable about studying studying quantification in terms of our ordinary English, and then moving into the symbolic notation for those sentences for quantifier logic, is we clarify exactly what we're talking about. So think about it this way: the sentence "something barks but something does not." You and I understand, just in sort of ordinary English, that we're talking about two separate things, right? The things that bark and the things that don't, or the unspecified thing that barks and the unspecified thing that doesn't bark. In logic, though, we've got to make clear that we're talking about two separate domains. Okay, so that's part of I think the fun of the work is that we get a lot of, at least I think we do, get a lot of clarification on our language. And then we could also, as we did with the "some dogs bark," we could also do this. Some dogs bark, but no cats bark. Right, so what I'm doing is taking my knowledge of cat as a cat, my knowledge of Brett as a sample cat, and I'm saying, okay, well, I'm going to not convert the sentence, but I'm going to generalize out to the group of cats altogether, and I'm going to say that none of the cats bark. Okay, so notice that we've got, the singular, we've got the quantified. Whether we've got a singular sentence or a quantified sentence, we can assert the simple or the compound, right? We either do or do not have a quantify or a connective, right, to compound the sentence. Okay, so what we're headed for now is then a focus on what we're dealing with when we're dealing with a quantified sentence. Okay, so first, how are we doing with a very brief summary of the statement types that we've dealt with, and then now we're going to leverage what we already know and expand on it. We'll leverage what we already know how to do. We'll leverage our skills like translating and so forth. We'll expand on it. Okay. So the logic of quantifier logic is the logic of quantified statements, quantified sentences. Right. So, we could take, remember earlier I'd mentioned that we could take what you and I know is a quantified statement. We could treat it as a singular, right? So take, for example, the sentence, Republicans retained control of the Senate. So let's just pretend, those very tight races where they probably are going to do a recount for Senate seats, that, I'm just going to pretend that's over already. So Republicans retain control of the Senate, but Democrats retain control of the House, right? So we're not talking about a named Republican or a named Democrat. We're talking about the group of thing. But we could talk about, capital R for Republicans retained control of the Senate, conjunction, right? Capital D for Democrats retain control of the House. We could certainly do that if we wanted to. But again, that putting it in singular in the notation of the singular statement kind of loses a little bit of the logical force, right? All right, so let's talk about this notation. So far, so good. Questions, problems, confusions? Is there anything I've written that is illegible? Really? You can read it? Wow! I'm excited. Okay. All right, so quantified statements are statements about relations. Actually, let me leave that off for right now. Are statements about domains of stuff, unspecified stuff. By the way, I particularly appreciate the way that Dr. Schnee introduces this material and walks through it. As somebody who, is struggled with quantifier logic, and then struggled with trying to present it and work through confusions. It seems to me that he's really clear, and there are some ways he articulates some ideas that just really pop to me. They resonate with me, as just beautifully encapsulating an idea. So I hope that you find that you say, oh wow, this is fun. This is, this isn't so bad because the presentation that he gives is so good. Okay. The text I think is quite nice here. I'm not saying it's not nice elsewhere, but I particularly like it here. All right. So I'm using pretty unsophisticated language when I talk about domains of stuff. But I hope that as we go along, it brings you into the discussion in a way that you find useful. All right, so let me grab another whiteboard. All right, so suppose that we have the universe of stuff, right? So this stuff, can be carved out. We've got dogs, we've got cats, right? We've got molecules. You might say, wait a minute, Mia, molecules? Well, there's an overlap, right, between molecules and dogs and molecules and cats. On the other hand, there's no overlap between dogs and cats and, I don't know, tables and chairs, right? Whatever, right? We've just got all sorts of stuff. Now, what I'm going to write here is what I like to call undifferentiated stuff. Right? So the undifferentiated stuff, I'm just gonna basically say, things X, Y, Z. Actually, I don't want dots there. Things X, Y, Z. So I can say something like this. We've got kind of dog stuff, right? We can talk about, table stuff, right? So let's look now at this in terms of grammar. All right, so Walter is a dog, right? I can translate that, and we have been translating it as follows. We've been translating a sentence like Walter is a dog as follows. We've been doing it, so you know what, let me do this just because I think the visual will be better. All right, so Walter is a dog. All right, so we can translate this as W, right? We've got our, and W, typically is, or sorry, the capital letter, is very often the letter that is associated with the first letter, or just is the first letter of the subject of the sentence, right? We could, if we wanted to, though, just because as long as we're consistent, as long as we have a uniform system of the uniform convention, right? Where in an argument, every time we see W, it's Walter is a dog. Or let's say we use D. Every time we see D, it's Walter is a dog. Doesn't matter what letter we use, right? But we could also include the predicate, right? So here's one way to do that. We put the predicate of the sentence first, and then in parentheses and lowercase letters, we say Walter. Or we could do this, dog, W, lowercase for the name Walter. I mean, there are any number of naming conventions that we can use for the notation that we're going to adopt, right? But notice in this case, in each case where we have the predicate has come first, and then the name Walter comes second, right? Notice up here, though, we've just got entity, right? Stuff that's dog. So notice what happens when we start working in quantifier logic. We need to, we don't have a name, an individual constant like Walter or Brett, right? So what we do is we use what's known as a variable, lowercase letters X, Y, and Z, and that's the stuff. And then the predicate of the ordinary English sentence, right, is now the category of thing of which we have multiple members, right? So let me back up just a little bit. Remember earlier, I mentioned, let me come up to the top here. Earlier, I mentioned that quantified sentences are about non-specified groups, right? Classes of thing, quantities of thing. So now, if we go back to where we just were, right? When we're looking at entity dog, right? We're not naming the dog, but we also don't know how many dogs we're talking about. And in quantifier logic, we get two quantities of thing. We get the universal and the existential. And we'll talk about that more formally in just a second. But the question here is, are we talking about everything, or are we talking about at least one? So let me go back to the previous whiteboard, right? So here, remember we had something barks, some dogs bark, but no cats bark. So we've got the something, we've got the universal negative no things. Okay. Okay, so let me pause. Thoughts? Okay, so we're talking, the stuffy stuff that we're talking about is the stuffy stuff that falls into or constitutes a class of thing, a group of thing, or is a member of a group of thing, or at least one or every. So we have, oops, let's keep it black. So we have two statement types in addition to the simple and compound in quantifier logic. We've got the universal and we've got the existential. Right? So remember we had entity dog in the previous whiteboard. We need to know how many we're talking about. So the universal is everything in the group. And it's everything is or is not. So that means that we've got an affirmative or a negative. And then the existential is at least, one. Is or again is not. So here again we've got the affirmative and the negative. Okay, so let's think about how we proceed with the notation. Okay, so if my domain of discourse is limited to dogs, when I assert dogs bark, I can translate into no, sorry, forgive me. I don't like that example. Oh no, let's leave it. Let's leave it that way actually. I can translate into quantifier logic as follows. Everything barks and notate it as follows. It's an upside down A followed immediately by a variable, and then the bark group or class of things that bark, and then the variable x. On the other hand, if I don't, oops, sorry about that. If I don't assume the limited domain, I translate as follows, and we need another whiteboard. All dogs bark, or every dog barks, and symbolize accordingly. And we'll talk about the standard translations in just a moment. So accordingly, we'd have universal x parenthesis. I can spell. Dog, arrow, bark. Variable, close paren. Okay, so here's what we know so far. So quantifier logic consists of two quantifiers, variables, connectives, and predicates. Why predicates? Well, because remember that what was in ordinary English the grammatical subject, right? It does stay the same, but we're now talking in the case of, let's say, every dog barks or all dogs bark, right? We're talking about things that are dogs, things that bark, right? So the stuffy stuff of the universe is sort of underlying, if you will, the dog stuff, the barking stuff. And so the grammatical subject, dogs, or right, that now becomes a predicate, and the grammatical predicate, of course, remains a predicate, but now we're talking about logical predicates. Okay. We will see shortly. So quantifier symbols are, so the logical symbols, let me clarify that. In other words, the symbols that mean something to logic are the universal, right? The existential, and as we'll see, the identity symbol. I think we've talked about it a little bit a while ago. Okay, so now let's come back to the aforementioned discussion. So we can have a universal affirmative, a universal negative. We can have an existential affirmative, an existential negative. Just as a note, because our textbook is designed with the standard keyboard in mind, a standard keyboard for the cell phone, a standard keyboard for a tablet, even a standard keyboard for, you know, a laptop or a tower, which means that the upside down A and the backwards E are not right easy to get at. You have to, you know, create special symbols. So what our textbook does is say, hey, let's just use capital A for the universal, and let's use regular, what's it called? Regular directioned, the ordinary direction of E for the existential, okay? When we're writing together, though, when I'm writing, I'll almost invariably use the upside down A. When I go ahead and update practice for you, I will replace the upside down A with the right side up A. Similarly, when I'm writing in class, I will use the backwards E for the existential, but the forwards E when we're looking at extra practice. Okay. How are we doing? So far, so good? So we have this. And let me show you, let me talk to you a little bit about how this is, why this is written with an arrow. So let me read through this. For every x, if that x is a dog, then that x barks. If it's a dog, it barks. Right? Notice that the sentence, all dogs are things that bark, or let me make it easier. All dogs are barking things, right? So if both classes of thing don't have a or if both classes of thing aren't nouns, then you make a noun phrase. So from barking, right, which is a verb, to barking thing, right, which is a noun phrase. So the copula, the conjugation of the verb to be, are, that gets replaced by the arrow. And this makes sense if we say, well, how can we reformulate this ordinary English all dogs are barking things sentence, well, we'd say, well, if it's a dog or whatever's a dog barks. So if you've got a dog, then you've got a barking thing. We sort of end up moving in that direction fairly seamlessly, it would appear. Thoughts? So far, so good, I hope. All right, so bear with me for just a sec. Yeah, okay, so now coming back to the aforementioned two quantifier statement types, and then they break out affirmative, negative. Let me go ahead and give you the standard ordinary English shorthand. All subject class are predicate class. No subject class are predicate class. Some subject class are predicate class. And finally, some subject class are not predicate class. And we'll talk about the standard notation. These are typically known as the four Aristotelian forms. And if we go back to the introduction of connectives when we started Boolean logic, I think one of the comments that I made was something to the effect that the system is really, just in terms of the basics, right, is not at all complex, right? We have simple statements and compound statements. And the compound statements are simple statements, at least one simple statement and at least one connective. So, you can, and then how many connectives are there? Just the three. So you've got simple statements, three connectives. And then as we moved forward in our work, and we got to the propositional portion of the show, as it were, we talked about the conditional and the biconditional. So now we have simple statements and 5 connectives. That's it for the whole freaking system. Right? And then it's what we did with those sentence types, right, that generated, a really robust logical system. We, classified statements as true or false. We understood truth definitions. We understood how to determine the truth or falsity of a given statement. And when I say statements are true or false, forgive me, I meant to say, they're tautologies, they're self-contradictory statements, they're logical falsities or truth table falsities, right? We could determine whether or not a truth functional argument was valid or not. And then we did derive conclusions of various and sundry valid arguments, demonstrated them, all from this, small starting point, small in terms of just, I guess simple starting point. Similarly here, if we say, yes, we know all this other stuff already, but now we're just looking at, what's going on with quantifier logic, same thing. I mean, we've got a logic that's effectively built out of 4 statements, 2 statement types, right? You'll notice that the 4 that I've written, all S or P, no S or P, some S or P, some S or not P, those get translated into quantifier logic notation in terms of the aforementioned quantifier symbols, the universal, the existential, but also conditionals, negations, and conjunctions. You'll see that in just a moment. That said, we don't have to, not all of our, I should say, quantified sentences are, come on, Mia, you can do it. Not all of our quantified sentences are compound, right? We know that already. All right, so I did my usual, and what I should have done was given us some more room. And again, I wanna get on the soapbox of the joys of logic. Get on the soapbox to say that this is such great work for clarifying our thinking. We clarify concepts, and we get a great sense, at least I hope we do, a skill set for strategic thinking. And we take this wherever we go. All right, so let's go ahead and translate these bad boys. So for every x, if that x is an S, then that x is a P. We're going to talk about the scope of the quantifier in just a moment. Then the universal negative. For every x, if that x is an S, then it's not the case that that x is a P, close paren. Now the existential. There is at least one thing that is an S and a P. And then finally, there is at least one thing that is an S, but not a P. How are we going? How are we going? Good one, Mia. How are we doing? What do we think?
Yeah, I'm kind of behind in the textbook, so I'm just kind of watching what you're doing for like future reference, basically.
Sure, understood, Berman. And I think you were here. I think you had arrived before I mentioned how I appreciate, in particular, the quantifier logic chapters in this textbook. I think that Dr. Schnee does just a lovely job of bringing us along. And this is not to say that I don't think the previous work is not good, but as I mentioned, a lot of us struggle with quantifier logic. Now, some people will say, and you may be one of them, I don't know, but I've had experiences where people will say, we're at the end of the semester, right? Can you believe it? We barely have 4 weeks left together. Anyway, point is that, by the way, let me just mention this very quickly, and then I promise I'll close the thread and actually resume it, or close the parenthetical and resume the thread. I was just thinking today that, this is our first ever COVID semester, right? I mean, never in our lives have we been in a situation where we are running classes online the way that we're running classes now. This is a first for us. We're doing it together. It's amazing. And I know that some of it is as a result, some of it is kind of extra hard, right? So, as always, if you run into trouble for any reason, please let me know. I'm here to help. Okay. If I don't help you, I'll find somebody who will. Anyway, let me go back. So close parentheses. So now I can't remember what I was saying. This is so typical of me.
You were mentioning S&P.
Yes, but I was saying something about the way that the material is presented being particularly. Oh, I know. So sorry. So Berman. Okay. So all this to say, like, I really appreciate the way that he presents stuff. Oh, no, now I remember. So some people have said to me in the past, Mia, why didn't we start with quantifier logic? Quantifier logic is so much easier than propositional and Boolean logic. And I say, well, because quantifier logic includes the all the truth functional stuff, or at least the notation, right? It's not the case that quantifier logic is truth functional. It's not. But what I mean is, it includes truth functional connectives. So it's kind of hard to start with quantifier logic and work backward. But if you are one of those who finds it really easy, awesome. But typically, Berman, so what I was all of this to say, what happens very often is because it's really nicely presented in this text, if you kind of get a sense of what's going on from us having this conversation, what typically happens is when you go into the text, it'll feel that much easier. Okay. That said, there are some tricky concepts, and we'll want to work on those more than just the sort of kind of gloss that we're getting tonight. Okay. All right. Any thoughts about the Aristotelian forms? Okay. So we'll hold on to these. We'll come back to them. But what I'd like us to do is now back up just a little bit to talk about the sort of the translation, or sorry, the quantifier statement mechanics, right? So, oops. And let me look at something really quickly before we move on. Okay, yeah. All right, so for the quantifier statement mechanics, what I have in mind is the following. The quantifier or the quantifier's scope is determined by parentheses. So, for example, if I say, if I write this, oops, forgive me. Let me try that again. Right now, the scope of the quantifier covers only dogs. For every x, if x is a dog, I mean, that's roughly what's being said, right? So we need parentheses to tell us the scope of the quantifier, right? So dog we need our domain in part carved out by the by the parentheses. When we have multiple predicates, right? If we just say, so suppose that, you say, you ask me, you want to know, what's in the house or who's in the house. And suppose that we already know we're talking about the house, right? That's our domain. I can say, well, everyone in there is a dog, which, like I said earlier, for the initial one of the initial whiteboards, I said if you've already assumed a restricted domain, then you would just say, oh, everything universal x dog x, right? But that can be dicey if somebody doesn't know what they're looking at. So, for example, right? So whoopsie. So unless I specify the domain, or it's somehow already known, is things in the house, we might read as everything in the universe is a dog, which would be a weird thing to say, right? But so, partly what I'm getting at here is that we either need to stipulate, make clear what the domain is, or we don't stipulate it sort of in advance, and the translation is as exhaustive as possible, right? All right, so the quantifier scope, we've got that. We also want to talk about a well-formed formula. So if a quantifier, or sorry, rephrase, not a quantifier. If a variable is unbound, then the formula is not well formed, right? So that's this guy. Okay, how are we doing? So far, so good? Oh, we did. Okay, sorry. I went a little bit out of order from the order of the textbook, so I wanted to make sure that I had, in fact, covered this. Okay, we've covered that. We've got our quantifiers. We've got our, right. Okay, so let me continue on then. The other thing that we want to think about in terms of mechanics is this. The scope of a quantifier, oops, is not affected by an individual constant, that is, by a name. So suppose that we say, so all the barking dogs are in front of Walter, right? So I'm going to return to the 4 Aristotelian forms very briefly. We'll focus on it more later, but I want to mention the forms now because you'll notice that this sentence is a little bit more complicated than what we've been looking at so far. But when we look at translating from ordinary English into quantifier logic, we want to think about which of the 4 forms kind of underpins, serves as the basis for the sentence at hand, the statement at hand. So notice that we've got the following: all this stuff, so all the barking dogs are, and then we've got a relation between the barking dogs and things in front of Walter, right? So basically, right, we've got front of, oops, once again, let me try this again. Front of Walter, and I'm going to use a W for Walter. Here's our standard, the beginning of our standard Aristotelian form, right? So the translation, though, involves things that are barking, things that are dogs, whereas our standard Aristotelian form is all SRP, where S is just one subject class, right? But we've got things that are barking, and we've got things that are dogs. Now let me once again back out of here because my writing is almost entirely illegible. All right, so all right, so we've got the following for every X. If X barks and is a dog, then X is in front of Walter. The fact that Walter is by way of this closed paren, right? The fact that Walter is bound by this closed paren doesn't mean that we're trying to quantify Walter, right? What we're doing is we're making sure that the X's that go with that universal quantifier are enclosed, right? Does that make some sense? So far, so good? Questions, problems, confusions? Okay, so we know that the scope of the quantifier, when we've got multiple predicates, is determined by the parentheses, right? If we need parentheses but we lack parentheses, then we've got what's known as a formula that is not well-formed, right? So a WFF is a well-formed formula. It's sort of logic's version of a grammatical sentence. And so when we don't have a well-formed formula, the sentence doesn't actually say anything, right? There's no meaning that we can glean from it. So we need to make sure that we've got parentheses where they belong. Let me give you another example of the idea of the scope of the quantifier, right? Suppose that the sentence is this instead. suppose that it's some cats are meowing, but Walter is barking. Here, the scope of the quantifier covers the meowing cats, right? It does not apply to the named entity Walter. So we end up with this there. And you know what? I'm running out of room. So hold on just a sec. So, nope, that's not going to work. Let me go to another whiteboard. Right? So there's no reason for us to put parentheses around, or sorry, there's no reason to extend the parentheses beyond the meowing cats, because all we're talking about are the things that are cats and things that are meowing. And then, oops, sorry. Nobody corrected me. Bad. Oops, wrong again. All right. Walter. Right? So we don't need any parentheses there. Thoughts. How are we doing so far? Okay, so let's do a super quick review on what we've got. Okay, we've got quantifiers, variables, individual constants, names, right? Predicates. Oops. Can't, no, that's right. That's wrong. Okay, and then of course, if we also need them, we've got connectives. How are we doing? So far, so good? Okay, now there are a couple of items that we haven't gone over specifically. We have not gone over chapter 23, section 1. And let's see, hold on just a sec, let me check. Okay, we talked about the domain. Okay. Yeah, so I think what I want to do is, and please don't let me forget if let's say come next week, I haven't picked up the 23.1 material. It's important, but I want to make sure we get through some other stuff first. And I think that the discussion of names and objects will be pretty straightforward when we get to it. What I want to focus on now, though, is a return to, now that we've got some of our basics, right? I want to return to the discussion of the Aristotelian forms, so that we can start to see how we can assess relationships between sentences, as well as how we can manipulate quantified statements to, if you will, say the same thing in differently ordered notation, or sometimes just different notation. So, for example, how we can get from a universal statement to an existential statement, but they say the same thing, right? So they're logically equivalent. Okay, but this is what we've done so far. All right, so let's talk about, or actually, you know what? I'm going to just bring up another. So here's what we want to talk about next. We want to talk about contradictories and equivalences. We should be able to get to, we should also be able to get to necessities and counterexamples. So by the way, so this is, wait. Oh, there we go. Okay, so contradictories, that's 24.4. And we want to get to equivalences. That's chapter 25. So I'm just making a brief list of what we haven't talked about yet, but what we'd like to get to. Oh, and you know what else I forgot earlier to, I forgot to put this on our list because I just mentioned it a few minutes ago. Come on, Mia. Names and objects. So 23.1. All right, so names, so we got contradictories, equivalences, necessities, necessarily true sentences, right? That's chapter 26. And then, so FO necessities, F first order counterexamples. So when you start seeing FO or FOL, now what basically first order logic language is all the stuff we've already learned, but plus it includes the identity symbol, it includes the quantifiers. And that's why we haven't talked about it as such until now, until we've just got to it. We've been talking about tautological this, tautological that, right? All right, so FO counterexamples, that's chapter 27. Okay. All right, so that's where we're headed. But let's come back now to the Aristotelian forms continued. All right, so we've got all SRP, no S, oops, no SRP. I did it again. I'll just move that over. Some SRP. some S are not P. Okay. Okay, so the universal affirmative and existential negative are contradictories. The universal negative and existential affirmative are contradictories. What's a contradictory? Well, we already know that two statements are contradictories when they can't be true at the same time and they can't be false at the same time. Right? We know that a self-contradictory statement is one that's always false, right? So it's a necessarily false statement. So what we're saying is this, right? So this, I'm gonna simplify the notation a little bit. We'll see if it helps. So what we're saying is this: a universal affirmative and an existential negative can't be true at the same time, can't be false at the same time. Similarly, the universal negative and the existential affirmative can't be true at the same time, can't be false at the same time. All right, so I'm telling you that this is the case. And maybe you say, sure, Mia, I see it, but let's chat about it, okay? Let's look at some examples to see if the examples help us wrap our head around the thing. And we'll also talk a bit about the placement of the negation. So first, does it make sense that the universal P and the existential negation P are respectively the universal affirmative and the existential negative? Right? So we could easily do this, right? Oops, forgive me. Well, actually, I'm going to put it down here, right? So everything is P, nothing is P. Something is P, something is not P. So we have universal X, P, X, universal X, negation, P, X, existential P, X, existential negation, P, X. Okay? So let me read through these one at a time, see how you're doing. Everything is P. For every X, X is P. Nothing is P. For every X, it's not the case that it's P. A little mouthy, I know, right? A little verbose. Something is P. There is at least one thing that is P. Again, a little verbose, but still precise, which is might seem strange. And then lastly, something is not P. Something is not P. There is something. It's not the case that it's P. All right, let me come back up here. All right. So sometimes sometimes the reason why I use the lower version, the bottom version that has fewer predicates and in general less notation is because sometimes it's easier to see. But let's now come back here to the contradictories. So we need to talk about whether or not it makes sense to you that these are contradictories, right? So if the universal affirmative is true, the existential negative is false. If the existential negative is true, the universal, did I say existential? Yeah. If the existential negative is negation is true, then the universal affirmative is false. Similarly, if the universal negative is true, the existential affirmative is false. If the existential affirmative is true, the universal negative is false. Right? Why do we want to know this? For a couple of reasons, one of which is the clarification of just our ordinary language, right? How we can improve being more exacting in the way that we articulate what we're trying to say, what we mean when we're talking about domains affirmatively or negatively. All right, so let me give you some examples and let's see if this helps. Okay, so all dogs are animals. Some dogs are not animals. All instruments are violins. Some instruments are not violins. Right? What do we think? Oh, I'm going to do it again like I usually do. Run out of room. I'm going to totally run out of room here. I'm going to just abbreviate. I for instrument. V for oh, come on, Mia. V for violin. And then I for instrument, V for violin. I can do the same thing up here. Might as well give us some more room. Okay, so first, you know, so I'm preying on what you know, right? Or I'm capitalizing on what you know. You know that the sentence all dogs are animals is true. You know the sentence some dogs are not animals is false. You know that the sentence all instruments are violins is false. You know the sentence some instruments are not violins is true. What you want to know, though, right, is the structure of the thing, right? What is it about the logical structure of a universal affirmative and the logical structure of an existential negative that makes them contradictories? Well, let me try something and see if you like this. Okay, so I definitely want to have your feedback here. Okay, so let's take any universal affirmative sentence. We'll just say SP, right? Does it make sense that I can basically nest circles, and the nesting of the circles provides a visual representation of the logical structure, all SRP, right? Does it also make sense to say, it's a little bit trickier, but it's not as pretty, if you will. Here's the P, and here's at least one S that's outside of the P. So some S are not P. Right? If every single S that exists, or sorry, if every single S there may be is in P, then this other diagram can't be the case. Let me give you another way to think about it. These are called Venn diagrams. When I shade the area of S outside of P, right? So the area of S outside of P is basically a no man's land. There can't be any S's there at all. So whatever S's there may be, they're all dumped into, right, the area of overlap, right? On the other hand, if we say, as we did in the previous diagram, using an X to designate at least one thing, if we say there is at least one S that's a P, notice now we've put an X where we shouldn't be able to put an X, right? So if the area that I'm shading right now, right, can't have anything there, and if this is the true sentence, then this sentence must be false. So if true, then false. Okay? Give me a sense of how you're doing. Some people hate the diagrams. Some people love them. What do you think? How are you doing? Oh, and I just realized, oh yeah. And if you can't chat, I mean, if you can't verbalize, give me a chat if you haven't done it already.
Yeah, for me, I think I'm getting it, like where it overlaps.
Okay. Sorry, Berman. I'm looking for the chat window because I know that Grady sometimes needs to use it, but I can't find it. Arg. Why does Zoom do this to me? Because, you know, clearly Zoom's out to get me, right? But there's no other explanation.
No pity.
No possible explanation. Hold on, folks. Let me try to find. Thank you for that, Berman. I appreciate it. So it's not like you're wondering what the heck's going on. You're doing okay. Oh, there's chat. Come on, Mia. Goodness sakes.
Yeah, it's nice seeing it illustrated, like how you did it.
The visual works? Okay, good.
Yeah.
Good. All right, good. Because like I said, some people just hate it. Like, Mia, why are you doing this? Right. Okay, good. And Grady, you're okay with that? Excellent. Cameron, hopefully you're doing okay too. You'll let us know if not.
Yeah, I'm still here.
Good. Okay.
All right. Hi.
Hang in there. All right. So let's work the other pair of contradictories, right? So remember we said universal affirmative, existential negative, contradictories, right? So sorry, contradictories examples. I'm sorry if you can hear my cat crying plaintively. So desperate to get out of the house. Not going to happen. She spends lots of time outside the house, but when it gets dark, we're not doing that anymore. All right. Let's go for universal negative, existential affirmative. Okay. So a true universal negative, no motorcycles are rabbits. Some motorcycles are rabbits. Right, so we've got universal X, MX for motorcycle, not RX for rabbits. I know I still owe you a bit of an explanation about, a bit of a discussion about the notation that the connectives that we're using. So we talked a little bit about the arrow, but we really didn't talk about why the negation goes on the right side of the arrow for the universal negative and why the negation goes on the right side of conjunction for existential negative, but we'll get there, right? So here again, I'm kind of capitalizing on what we know to be true and what we know to be false. Right? And now another pair, this time with a false universal negative, but a true particular affirmative. So it's false to say that no dogs are pit bulls. Some dogs are pit bulls. Oopsie. Uh-oh, and here she comes up the stairs. Hi, Brett. No, I'm not letting you out. I'll just use a P for pit bulls. Okay. So the diagramming is for the universal negative is not as intuitive as the nesting that we did for the universal affirmative. But let's go ahead and start with that. So remember I mentioned that, yes, I'm capitalizing on what you know to be true and what you know to be false. But we're not interested in what you know to be true and what you know to be false. We're interested just in the logical structure. So the form of the universal negative is contradicts the form of the existential affirmative, just as the form of the universal affirmative contradicts the form of the existential negative. So here's no SRP, right? So here are the S's, here are the P's. There's not even one S that's a P. There's no overlap, if you will. There's no nesting. Then we've got some dogs are pit bulls, so we can say here are the P's, and here's at least one S. So I put the X there next to the S, which denotes the existence of at least one, right? But we can work the Venn diagrams. Remember that shading represents emptiness. In other words, wherever there's shading, it's impossible for anything to be there. Right? So the shading that I'm working right now on the universal negative, it's as if the two S and P circles are split the way they were in my initial diagram. Right? It's like that up there, right? Oops. Where do you suppose the X is going to go on the existential affirmative, right? So we've got if S, then not P, and then we have both S and P. Now the if S, we don't know that we have S, but basically that's what we're saying, right? So does it make sense to say that if the universal negative is true, then there can't be an X here? This can't happen. Similarly, or in contradistinction, if there's an X here, in other words, if the existential affirmative is true, then the universal negative can't be true. Right? What do we think? How are we doing? Pretty okay? Okay, so let me just sum up this way. Oops. So if one of the pair is true, the other must be false, and vice versa. Now, of course, we haven't talked about how we know that a quantified statement is true or false, right? It doesn't, we can't sort of compute it or calculate or determine it in the way that we work a truth table, but we'll get there, right? But we at least know that these are contradictories, okay? But we also want to talk about equivalences, right? So we've got contradictories, but now let's talk about equivalences. And these are really, really helpful to us for the same reason that contradictories are helpful to us, right? So you know, one point that I didn't mention earlier about, or one reason I didn't mention earlier about why we want to know what the contradictories are is because when we're in a proof, right, if we can derive a contradiction in a derivation, in a proof, right, then we're in a position to either eliminate that contradiction, or we're in a position to, let's say, get out of a subproof and introduce a negation. Okay. All right, so let's just finish off with equivalences, and then I think we've done a lot. We pretty well caught up to where we need to be. And then what we can do next week is we can maybe start with some practice, review some concepts, and then move on to the last couple of chapters that we have to get to. If I'm right about this. Oh, wait, hold on. Oh, I'm such a dork. You already knew this. So I've got us a little bit ahead of schedule now. I apologize. I misread our schedule. I don't know what I'm doing. You already know that. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, sorry, my bad. Do you still say that? Does anybody still say my bad?
Yeah, I say that a lot, actually.
Thank you, Barman. I appreciate it. I got to keep up with the kids, you know. Okay, yeah. So I do apologize, but because I should have been more aware of what I was doing. At the same time, it's not bad that we're covering this territory, because basically, you know, next week we'll do exactly what I said we'll do, which is we're going to practice a whole bunch of stuff. We're going to pick up 23 point, whatever it was, 3 or 1 that we need to talk about. Super interesting and worth knowing. So practice, review, and then move into new stuff. But really, you know, practice is, as always, going to be key. And as usual, you know that I owe you practice for quantifier logic. Remind me before we break off tonight to just remind you that there still is practice with additional practice, for derivations. Okay, so equivalences. Here I'm gonna list them, and then we can chat a bit about them. So the universal affirmative is equivalent to an existential with a negation on either side of the quantifier. So everything is equivalent to it's not the case that there is something that's not, or a less verbose way of putting it is everything is equivalent to it's not the case that something isn't. Okay. Then we can say that the universal negative is equivalent to the existential with a negation out front. Notice, if you will, think about it as a version of De Morgan's, where the negation on the right side of the universal gets pushed out front of the quantifier, which is exchanged for an existential. Then we have the existential which is equivalent to a universal with a negation on either side of the quantifier. And then lastly, the existential negative right, is demorganized, right? So that the negation gets pushed out, either pushed back or out of, depending on which direction you're going. Quantifier is changed. Sometimes you'll see this set of equivalences listed as change of quantifier. It's like a rule that you can cite. So you make a move, you write a substitution, and you cite the number, and then the justification in the derivation is, change a quantifier or quantifier exchange, right? So it's oftentimes used as a rule. We prove the rules, which is much more fun. Okay, so I'll leave it off there. And we'll look at examples and so forth next week. What I want to do before I stop my share on this thing is I want to save, all of these so that, oops, that's not what I want to do. Darn it. Forgive me. I want to, actually, I'll just leave the screen share up. Oh, no, I don't. I want to save. Okay, save. Oh, I see. I can save all of them at once. All right. So those are saved. I don't know where they're saved. I will find out where they're saved. And I will post the notes if you want them. Okay, so before we break off for this evening, okay, so just real quick, housekeeping items. I try not to post a lot of announcements because I know that you're already super busy. You've already got a lot on your plate. But when I think it's really important, I do post the announcements. So when you get a chance, take a look at these. The Pierce College, along with the sister colleges in the LA Community College District, is making available, I think they're gift certificates for Thanksgiving meals for Pierce community members. So, with so much disruption in our lives, everything from people losing work or, not being able to get out and shop or whatever the situation is, the having that as an option might be really nice. So if you know somebody who's food insecure or whatever and is a member of the Pierce community, please share this last announcement with them. And then next Thursday, I'll post a note to this effect, but I'm going to cancel office hours because there is a panel discussion in the 5 o'clock hour that I'd like to attend, and I hope you will too. I'm interested for a number of reasons, but I also want to support my colleague in sociology, who's also a department member. So philosophy and sociology are together in one department. So my friend and colleague James McKeever is one of the panelists, and so I'd like to support him, and I hope that you'll be able to attend as well. And then lastly, there's someone at Glendale Community College who has initiated basically a support group for the Armenian community, and I know that there are quite a few Armenian students at Pierce. So I thought maybe given everything that's been happening of late, that this might be of interest. So if you know somebody who might be interested, please share the post with them. So those I wanted to let you know about. And then the last thing is this. So sorry, you know what I should have done so you don't have to see all the junk. There we go. Ta-da! Student view. All right, so the last thing I want to show you is this. Additional practice. If you're still working on the Boolean and propositional logic stuff, and you haven't got to this extra practice yet, consider undertaking it. I hope it's helpful. If you have any questions about it, let me know. As you know, I'm here to help. And if I can't help you, I will find somebody who will. In other words, if you say, Mia, it's just not working for me, then obviously also talk to Lindsay, who's our course embedded tutor. But I certainly want you to get the help you need. I will add to this, right? I'll add some stuff on quantifier logic, I hope this week. All right, so that's all I got. Questions, problems, confusions? anything you want to talk about before you head off into the evening?
For me, I just have a question like after class.
Sure. Okay, Daniel, I'll make sure not to end the session. Anybody else? You'll let me know if you have questions, problems, confusions. The good news is we've got a good chunk of practice time before we need to think about a quiz, right? That reminds me, I read through discussion forum posts that I think were due on Sunday, but the deadline was Monday. If you didn't complete a discussion 3 and you want to do it, please let me know and I'll reopen it for you. Okay. Otherwise, I will. If I don't see you during office hours or outside of office hours, I'll see you next week, next Tuesday. Have a good one.
Bye.
Bye.